An orphan ages out of the system with nothing but a rusty key to a forgotten barn. But what he discovered inside wouldn't just give him a future, it would rewrite his entire past. If you believe that our past doesn't have to define us and that everyone deserves a second chance, maybe hit that subscribe button. It helps tell stories like this one, stories that matter. The key was cold, colder than the October air biting at my exposed wrists, colder than the metal gate of the St. Jude's Home for Boys that had just clicked shut behind me. For 18 years, that sound had been a constant, the sound of being locked in, of being contained. Now it was the sound of being locked out. The finality of it was a hollow ache in my chest. I turned and looked at the brick building one last time. It wasn't a home. It was a holding place, a warehouse for kids the world had misplaced. I had been one of its longest-serving inmates, a lifer since I was 4. All I had to show for it was a thin, state-issued jacket, a cardboard box with a change of clothes and a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, and this key. Mrs. Gable, the administrator with a face permanently etched in mild disapproval, had handed it to me in a small manila envelope. "This is it, Leo," she'd said, not unkindly, but with the detached air of someone processing paperwork. "Your grandfather, Arthur Vance, left this for you. It's the key to a barn on his property in Havenwood. The house itself was condemned, I'm afraid, but the land and the barn are legally yours as of your 18th birthday, which is today." She slid a thin file across the desk. It contained a deed, a map, and a one-way bus ticket. "There's no money, no trust fund, just this. Good luck." Just this, a rusty, old-fashioned skeleton key. I closed my hand around it, the jagged teeth digging into my palm. It was the only thing I had ever owned that connected me to someone, to a life before St. Jude's. My memories of my grandfather were fractured like faded photographs. A scratchy wool sweater that smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco. A large, calloused hand holding mine as we walked through a field of tall grass. The sound of a low, rumbling laugh. And then, nothing. He'd dropped me off at St. Jude's one rainy afternoon and never came back. The story I'd been told, the one I'd told myself for 14 years, was simple. He abandoned me. He didn't want me. I was a burden he'd finally shed. That story had become the foundation of who I was. The quiet kid in the back of the class. The boy who never got picked for foster weekends. The one who learned that expecting nothing was the safest way to avoid disappointment. Now I stood outside the only world I'd ever known, holding a key to a past that had rejected me. The bus station was a 10-block walk. Each step felt like I was walking a tightrope over a vast, empty canyon. The city sounds, the traffic, the sirens, the distant shouts were a language I didn't speak. Inside St. Jude's, everything was scheduled, controlled, muted. Out here, the world was a chaotic roar. I clutched the strap of the cheap duffel bag they'd given me and kept my head down. The bus ticket was for a 3:00 p.m. departure. I had 2 hours to kill and nowhere to spend them. I found a bench in a small, neglected park and sat, pulling the key from my pocket. It was heavy, solid iron, intricate but not ornate. A working key for a working lock. What kind of man leaves his grandson a barn but no home? A broken-down building on a piece of land I'd never seen. It felt like a joke or an insult. A final reminder of how little I was worth to him. Maybe I should just throw it away, toss it into the gutter, sell the bus ticket for a few bucks, and disappear. Start over as a ghost, a person with no name and no past. It was tempting. The weight of that key was the weight of a history I didn't want, a history of being left behind. But where would I go? What would I do? The state had raised me to be compliant, to follow rules, to fill out forms. It hadn't raised me to be free. The key, as useless as it seemed, was a destination, a single solid point on a map. It was the only direction I had. The bus ride was 6 hours long, winding its way out of the city's concrete maze and into the rolling hills and farmland of the state's interior. I watched the landscape change through the smudged window. Skyscrapers gave way to suburban sprawl, then to small towns, then to nothing but fields and forests. The sky opened up, vast and gray. With every mile that passed, a strange feeling began to settle in my gut. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was more like quiet. The noise in my head, the constant chatter of fear and resentment that had been my companion for years, was starting to fade. Out here there was space. There was silence. The bus dropped me off at a gas station on the outskirts of Havenwood, just as dusk was settling. The town was little more than a main street with a few dozen storefronts, a blinking traffic light, and a water tower with the town name painted in peeling letters. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a world away from the city's exhaust fumes and decay. The map in my file was a hand-drawn relic, a series of turns onto roads with names like Old Creek Road and Hemlock Lane. The property was marked with a small X about 3 miles out of town. There was no taxi service, no one to call. So I started walking. The road was unlit, and the trees on either side formed a dark canopy overhead. The only sound was the crunch of my worn sneakers on the gravel shoulder and the distant chirping of crickets. I've spent my life surrounded by people, by the constant noise of 100 other boys in a crowded hall. I'd never known this kind of profound solitude. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. For the first time, I felt like I was truly alone, not just lonely in a crowd. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A rusted mailbox half hidden in overgrown weeds, the name Vance barely visible in the moonlight. A gravel driveway disappeared into a thicket of trees. I pushed through the branches, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The driveway opened into a clearing, and I saw them. The ruins of a small farmhouse, its roof caved in, windows like hollow eyes, and next to it, weathered but still standing, was the barn. It was huge, far bigger than I'd imagined. A classic gambrel-roofed structure, its red paint faded to a dull, mottled brown. The wood was silvered with age, and ivy climbed up one side like a green scar. The main doors were massive, held shut by a thick, rusty chain and a heavy-duty padlock. My heart sank. The key in my pocket was a skeleton key, old and delicate. It wasn't for a modern padlock. For a moment, I just stood there, staring. Of course it was the wrong key. Of course this was all a cruel joke. I was supposed to come all this way just to be locked out, to sleep in the ruins of a collapsed house, a final testament to my grandfather's neglect. I kicked at the dirt, a surge of familiar, bitter anger rising in my throat. I was so stupid to have felt that flicker of something. On the bus, hope was a trap, and I had walked right into it. I circled the barn, running my hands along the rough wooden planks, looking for another way in. A broken window, a loose board. Around the back, almost completely hidden by a tangle of thorny bushes, was a smaller, human-sized door. It was set deep into the stone foundation, and it had a different lock, an old iron plate with a keyhole that looked exactly like the silhouette of the key in my hand. My breath caught. My fingers trembled as I pulled the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a smooth, metallic whisper. It felt like it had been waiting. I turned it. There was a loud, grating clunk as the ancient mechanism inside turned over. For the first time in what must have been years, the door creaked open into absolute darkness. A wave of cool, musty air washed over me, the scent of old hay, dry earth, and time itself. I stood on the threshold, my hand on the cold iron key, and took my first step inside. The darkness inside the barn was absolute, a thick, velvety black that swallowed the faint moonlight from the open door. I fumbled for the small flashlight St. Jude's had included in my departure kit, a cheap plastic thing that cast a weak, watery beam. I swept the light across the interior, and my jaw dropped. This wasn't just a barn, it was a workshop. A massive cathedral-like space filled with the ghosts of forgotten work. A thick layer of dust covered everything, sparkling in my flashlight beam like a blanket of gray snow. Along one wall stood a long, heavy workbench, cluttered with old tools, jars of nails and screws, and stacks of wood. A table, saw, a drill press, and a lathe stood silent and shrouded, like sleeping iron giants. Sawdust lay in thick drifts on the floor. In the center of the vast space was a half-finished project, the skeleton of a wooden boat, its curved ribs reaching up into the darkness like the bones of a great beast. My grandfather had been a builder, a creator. I walked deeper into the barn, the flashlight beam dancing over forgotten details. Coils of rope hanging from pegs, old metal lanterns, a stack of faded canvas sails. It was a time capsule, a museum of one man's life, my grandfather's life. And he had left it for me. It was overwhelming. This wasn't just an empty building, it was a place filled with his presence. I could almost feel him here, could almost hear the rasp of a saw, the tap of a hammer. For the first time, the man from my fragmented memories started to feel real. But why? Why give me this and nothing else? Why leave me to the mercy of the state for 14 years? The anger and confusion were still there, a knot in my stomach. I needed answers. I started searching, not knowing what I was looking for. I ran my hands over the workbench, my fingers leaving clean trails in the thick dust. I opened drawers filled with rusty tools and wood shavings. Nothing. I checked the loft, climbing a rickety wooden ladder into the upper level. It was filled with bales of straw, so old they crumbled to dust at my touch. Still nothing. I was about to give up, to curl up in a corner on a pile of old canvas and succumb to the exhaustion that was pulling at my bones, when my light caught something under the workbench. Tucked away in the darkest corner was a heavy, military green footlocker. It was locked with a simple padlock. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. It had to be. The padlock was old and rusted. I found a crowbar among the tools on the bench, and with a few sharp, grunting tugs, the shackle snapped. My hands were shaking as I lifted the heavy lid. The air inside smelled of paper and camphor. On top was a neatly folded wool blanket, the same scratchy kind I remembered from my childhood. Beneath it were several thick envelopes, a leather-bound journal, and stacks of bundled cash. I pulled out one of the stacks. They were $100 bills. I counted one bundle, $10,000. There were at least 10 bundles. My head spun. $100,000. I sat down hard on the dusty floor, my legs suddenly weak. I had never held more than $20 in my entire life. This was a fortune. This was impossible. This changed everything. I wasn't destitute. I wasn't helpless. I could go anywhere, do anything. But the money was secondary to the envelopes. One was addressed to me, Leo, in a strong, slightly slanted script. My hands trembled so badly I could barely tear it open. I pulled out a thick sheet of stationery and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. The words blurred through the tears that instantly filled my eyes. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you are a man. I am so sorry. I am sorry for everything. I know you must hate me. I know you must believe I abandoned you. I need you to know that isn't the truth. Not the whole truth, anyway." I had to stop and take a deep, shuddering breath. The directness of it, the immediate acknowledgement of my pain, was a punch to the gut. I continued reading, my flashlight beam shaking on the page. "When you were 4, I got sick. Something in my lungs," the doctor said. a consequence of a lifetime of breathing in sawdust. They told me I had a few years, at best. I had no one else to leave you with. Your grandmother had passed, and the rest of our family was long gone. I was faced with a choice. I could keep you with me and let you watch me wither away, leaving you an orphan with nothing when I was gone. Or I could give you up to the state where I knew you would be fed and clothed and have a roof over your head. It was the hardest decision of my life, Leo. It broke my heart in a way that sickness never could. Leaving you at that gate was like tearing off a part of my own soul. I did it because I loved you. I did it so you would have a chance, even if it was a hard one. I was sobbing now, great, heaving gulps of air and tears, the sound swallowed by the vast, silent space of the barn. 14 years of bitterness, of a carefully constructed wall of resentment crumbled in a matter of minutes. He hadn't abandoned me. He had saved me. It was a sacrifice, not a rejection. The story I had built my entire identity on was a lie. The letter continued. I've spent the last years of my life getting this place ready for you. The money in this box is everything I saved. It's not a fortune, but it should be enough to get you started. Sell the tools, sell the boat, sell the land if you have to. Take the money and build a life for yourself. A good life, that is all I have ever wanted for you. But I have to warn you, there are people who want this land. A company called Mountain View Holdings. They've been trying to buy me out for years, trying to scare me off. They want to build luxury condos here, or some such nonsense. They are persistent and they are not good people. Be careful. The deed is in this box. This land, this barn, it's all yours. It's not much of a home, I know. But it's a start. It's all I could give you. Be a good man, Leo. Better than me. Your loving grandfather, Arthur. I read the letter 3 times, the words etching themselves onto my heart. The grief was immense, a tidal wave of sorrow for the man I never got to know, for the years we had lost. But underneath the grief, something new was taking root, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection. I wasn't just Leo, the orphan from St. Jude's. I was Leo Vance, Arthur Vance's grandson. This barn wasn't just a building, it was an inheritance, a legacy of love and sacrifice. I looked around at the dusty, silent workshop, at the half-finished boat, at the tools lying in wait. He hadn't just left me a key to a barn, he had left me a key to myself. I spent my first night of freedom sleeping on the floor of my grandfather's barn, wrapped in the wool blanket he had left for me, his letter clutched in my hand. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I felt found. But as the sun began to filter through the cracks in the wooden walls, a new reality began to set in. I had $100,000, a piece of land, and a warning. Mountain View Holdings. The name sounded corporate and faceless, a predator hiding in the tall grass. My grandfather had fought them. Now it seemed it was my turn. The choice he laid out for me was clear. Take the money and run, or stay and face whatever was coming. And I had no idea what to do. You know, it's a strange thing to have the story of your life completely rewritten in a single night. For 18 years, I was the boy who was thrown away. And in a few paragraphs, I became the boy who was protected. That shift, it changes everything. It changes how you see the world, how you see yourself. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where a single truth comes to light and turns your whole world upside down? It's terrifying, but it's also a gift. It's the moment you get to decide who you're going to be, based not on the lies you were told, but on the truth you've found. I know many of you watching have your own stories, your own hidden truths. If this is hitting home for you, maybe share a little of that feeling in the comments. Not the details, just the feeling. You're not alone in this. This community is built on people who understand that the past is a complicated place. Now, let's get back to that first morning in the barn. and the choice I had to make. The first light of dawn painted the dusty air in strokes of gold. I woke up stiff and cold, but with a clarity I hadn't felt before. The money was real. The letter was real. The threat was real. My first priority was to get my bearings and understand what I was up against. I took a few $1,000s from one of the bundles, stuffed it into my pockets, and hid the footlocker back under the workbench, covering it carefully with old tarps and pieces of wood. It didn't feel safe, but it was the best I could do for now. I walked into Havenwood, the 3-mile journey feeling much shorter in the daylight. The town was slowly coming to life. A bakery was venting the warm, sweet smell of fresh bread into the street. An old man was sweeping the sidewalk in front of a hardware store. People nodded as I passed, a gesture of simple rural acknowledgement that was entirely foreign to me. At St. Jude's, you learn to avoid eye contact, to make yourself small. Here, people looked at you. They saw you. My first stop was a diner called the Corner Booth. I ordered a massive breakfast, the first real meal I'd had in years that wasn't mass-produced and served on a plastic tray. As I ate, I listened to the conversations around me. Farmers talking about the lack of rain, a couple of waitresses gossiping about local news. It was the lifeblood of a small town, a network of shared experience. I felt like a complete outsider, an alien studying a foreign species. After breakfast, I found the town hall, a small brick building with a flagpole out front. Inside, a woman with a kind face and a mountain of gray hair sat behind a counter. I asked her if she had any information on the Vance property on Hemlock Lane. Her expression softened. "Oh, Arthur's place," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Such a shame what happened to him. He was a good man, a bit stubborn, but good. She told me what she knew. My grandfather had been a master carpenter and boat builder, known throughout the county for his craftsmanship. He'd lived a quiet life after his wife passed away. And then she confirmed the other part of his letter. That Mountain View Holdings Company made his last years a misery, she said, her voice lowering. They bought up all the surrounding parcels of land. Arthur's place was the last holdout. They wanted it bad. Offered him a fortune, he told me. But he wouldn't sell. Said this land was his family's legacy. They didn't like that. She told me they had tried to claim his property lines were wrong, tried to get his land condemned for zoning violations. They'd made his life difficult, a constant barrage of legal threats and intimidation. The town clerk directed me to the local law office of a woman named Evelyn Albright. If anyone knows the legal mess Mountain View left behind, it's Evie, she'd said. Ms. Albright's office was on the second floor of an old Victorian house on Main Street. The woman herself was sharp and efficient, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a practical suit, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Leo Vance," she said, looking at me over the top of her glasses as I sat in the chair opposite her desk. "I wondered when you might show up. I was Arthur's attorney." My surprise must have shown on my face. "He was a client, and I'd like to think he was a friend," she clarified. "He set up the transfer of the deed to you before he passed. He wanted to make sure everything was in order for when you turned 18. I hesitated, then decided to trust the instinct my grandfather clearly had. I told her everything about the key, the barn, the footlocker. I didn't mention the exact amount of money, but I told her about the letter and the warning about Mountain View Holdings. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen on her desk. "That sounds just like Arthur," she said with a wry smile. "Dramatic, stubborn, and smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He never told me about the money, but I'm not surprised. He didn't trust banks. As for Mountain View, they are everything he said they were. They're a subsidiary of a much larger development corporation. Their business model is to acquire large tracts of rural land for pennies on the dollar and then flip them for massive profits by building resorts or high-end housing developments. They are ruthless. She explained that after my grandfather's death, Mountain View had tried to claim the property was abandoned and seize it for back taxes, even though Arthur had paid them years in advance. Ms. Albright had fought them off, showing them the legal trust that transferred the property to me upon my 18th birthday. They backed off, she said, but they're not gone. They're just waiting. They probably assume you're a kid from the system who will be desperate for cash. They'll come to you with an offer, a big one, probably more money than the place is worth. Her words hung in the air. This was the choice my grandfather had written about, laid bare in the sterile light of a law office, the easy way out. "What would you do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ms. Albright looked at me, her gaze steady. "It's not my decision, Leo, it's yours. You could take their money and no one would blame you. You could go to college, travel, start a business. You don't owe this town or your grandfather's memory anything. His sacrifice was meant to give you freedom, not a cage." She paused, then leaned forward slightly. "But I will tell you this. Your grandfather loved that land. He saw something there worth protecting. He believed that some things shouldn't have a price tag. If you choose to fight, it will be long and it will be hard. They will try to bury you in legal fees and wear you down. But," she added, a flicker of steel in her eyes, "you have his letter. You may have the proof of their harassment that he never got to use in court. Arthur was meticulous. I'd bet my license he kept records of everything they did." I left her office with a folder of legal documents and a heavy weight on my shoulders. The choice was no longer abstract. It had names and dates and consequences. For the rest of the day, I walked around Havenwood. I bought supplies at the hardware store, a heavy-duty lantern, cleaning supplies, a new padlock for the barn door, and another for the footlocker. The man behind the counter, a burly guy named Sal, recognized my name. "Vance, you Arthur's grandson?" I nodded. "Good to see you," he said with a genuine smile. "Your granddad was a good customer, a real artist with wood. If you need anything, you let me know." That small interaction, that simple thread of connection struck me deeply. In this town, my name meant something. My grandfather's life had left a mark. I wasn't just an anonymous orphan anymore. I had a history here. As I walked back to the property in the late afternoon, I felt a sense of belonging I had never experienced before. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. That evening I sat in the barn, the powerful new lantern casting a warm, steady glow over the workshop. The space felt less intimidating now, more like a sanctuary. I thought about Ms. Albright's words. He believed that some things shouldn't have a price tag. I looked at the half-finished boat, its frame a testament to a life cut short. I thought of the faceless corporation that had tormented a dying man, trying to steal his legacy. And I thought of the little boy he had saved, the only way he knew how. Taking the money would be easy. I could erase my past, create a new future from scratch. But I was beginning to realize I didn't want to erase it anymore. My past, with all its pain and confusion, had led me here, to this barn, to this legacy. My grandfather didn't just leave me money. He left me a story. He left me a fight. And as I sat there in the quiet of the workshop he built, I knew I couldn't walk away from it. I couldn't let his last stand be for nothing. Selling this land wouldn't just be a business transaction. It would be a betrayal. It would be abandoning him, just as I had once thought he had abandoned me. The decision settled over me, not with a crash, but with a quiet sense of rightness. I was going to stay. I was going to fix up the house. I was going to find the records my grandfather kept. I was going to fight. I didn't know how, and I was terrified. But for the first time in my life, I knew why. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. I was fighting for him. I was fighting for me. The next morning, I went back to the footlocker, but this time I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the journal. It was a simple, sturdy book, its leather cover worn smooth with use. The pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting, the same strong, slanted script from the letter. It wasn't a diary of feelings, but a meticulous log. Dates, times, names. Every phone call from Mountain View Holdings. Every registered letter. Every visit from their lawyers and surveyors. He had documented it all. He described phone calls where they offered him insultingly low amounts, then absurdly high ones. He wrote about them sending surveyors who accidentally strayed onto his property, planting stakes where they had no right to be. He detailed veiled threats about eminent domain, about the town council being on their side. He even noted the license plates of cars that would park at the end of his driveway for hours at a time. It was a detailed, chilling account of corporate harassment, and at the end of many entries he would simply write, "For Leo." Reading his words, I felt a cold fury build inside me. They hadn't just been trying to buy his land. They had been trying to break his spirit. They had been tormenting a man who they knew was old and alone, who they didn't know was also sick and fighting to leave a legacy. For the grandson he loved, this journal wasn't just a record, it was a weapon. My first task was to secure the property and make a part of it livable. The farmhouse was a lost cause for now, a project for another year, another budget. But attached to the back of the house was a small, self-contained workshop or mudroom that was in better shape. Its roof was mostly intact, and the foundation was solid. With some work, I could make it a place to sleep that wasn't the barn floor. I spent the next few weeks in a blur of hard physical labor. I used some of the money to buy lumber, insulation, and tools from Sal's hardware store. He gave me a knowing look when I bought a stack of no trespassing signs. "Good for you, kid," he'd grunted. "Don't let the bastards grind you down." I learned more in those weeks than I had in 18 years at St. Jude's. I learned how to patch a roof, how to frame a wall, how to run basic wiring from a generator I bought. Every time I got stuck, I would go into the barn and look at my grandfather's tools, his workbench. I'd run my hands over the smooth, worn handles of his chisels and planes. It was like he was there guiding me. I found books on carpentry and boat building on a shelf, and I read them at night by lantern light. His notes were in the margins. It was like a conversation across time. Slowly, the small room took shape. I put in a new window looking out over the fields. I built a simple bed frame, a small table, and a set of shelves. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had built it with my own hands, on my own land. Every night I would fall into bed, my body aching with a satisfying exhaustion, and feel a profound sense of peace. I was building a home. One afternoon, as I was clearing out a thicket of overgrown brush near the barn, my shovel hit something hard. I dug around it and unearthed a metal box, rusted but sealed tight. It was an old ammunition can. With a groan of protest, the hinges gave way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was more of my grandfather's story. There were old photos, a young woman with a beautiful smile. My grandmother, I presumed. A photo of a much younger Arthur holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket, me. There were more letters, these written to his wife after she had passed, telling her about me, about his hopes for my future. And at the bottom of the box was a thick file folder. The label on it read simply, "Mountain View, the Truth." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was what Ms. Albright had hoped for. I took the file back to my small room and opened it. It was worse than I could have imagined. My grandfather, a man with only a high school education, had conducted a masterful investigation. He had uncovered their corporate structure, tracing them back to a parent company with a history of environmental violations. He had found evidence that they had bribed a local zoning official to get initial permits approved, had copies of internal memos, though I couldn't figure out how he'd gotten them, that discussed their strategy for acquiring his land, which they referred to as the holdout problem. The plan was to use all necessary leverage, legal and otherwise, to force a sale. The smoking gun was a set of geological surveys. Mountain View had told the town their plan was to build a low-impact residential community, but these surveys, which my grandfather had somehow obtained, showed they were testing the ground for something else. They were looking for the best place to sink a deep well. A note in his handwriting was clipped to the front. They don't want the land, they want the water. The aquifer that feeds this whole valley runs right under my property. It all clicked into place. Their fight wasn't for a few acres of real estate. It was for control of the region's water supply. They would drain the aquifer dry to feed a massive resort or a bottling plant, and the farms and homes in the whole valley would be left with dust. They weren't just trying to bully an old man. They were trying to steal the lifeblood of an entire community. My grandfather hadn't just been protecting his legacy. He had been protecting everyone. The next morning, I was at Evelyn Albright's office before she even had her lights on. I laid the journal and the file from the ammo can on her desk. She read through them in silence, her expression growing grimmer with each page. When she was done, she took off her glasses and looked at me. "My God," she whispered. "Arthur, you magnificent, stubborn old fox." She looked at me, and for the first time I saw not just a lawyer, but a fierce ally. "Leo," she said, her voice firm, "this changes everything. This isn't just a harassment claim anymore. This is evidence of conspiracy, potential fraud, and environmental endangerment. They haven't just been playing dirty, they've been breaking the law." She explained the stakes. We could take this to the state attorney general. We could file a civil suit that would tie them up in court for years. We could leak it to the press. We had options, powerful options. But, she warned, the moment we make a move, they will come after you with everything they have. They will try to discredit you, to paint you as a delinquent kid trying to extort them. They will try to bury us in motions and legal fees. They have millions. We have... She trailed off. "We have this," I said, tapping the file. "We have the truth." A few days later, the black SUV pulled up my driveway just as I knew it would. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was polished, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, a representative from Mountain View Holdings. He said he was here to express his condolences for my grandfather's passing and to make me an offer, a way to help me start my new life. He offered me $500,000, cash. He had the paperwork right there in his briefcase. All I had to do was sign. "Think about it, son," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You can walk away from this burden, go to college, see the world, or you can stay here trying to fix up a pile of rotten wood. This is a life-changing opportunity." I looked him in the eye. I thought about my grandfather, alone and sick, facing men just like this one. I thought about the community in Havenwood, the people who had shown me kindness, who had no idea what was being planned beneath their feet. "The land's not for sale," I said. His smile tightened. "I think you should reconsider. We can be very generous." Or, he added, his voice dropping an octave, "things can become very complicated. For a young man with your background, a legal battle would be unwise." It was a threat, wrapped in a velvet glove. "My background is as the grandson of Arthur Vance," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "And he taught me that some things aren't for sale. I think you should leave now." For a long moment he just stared at me, his mask of civility cracking. Then he turned, got back in his SUV, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I stood there, my heart pounding, the adrenaline singing in my veins. The fight was no longer a future possibility. It was here. It had begun. I was terrified, more than I had ever been in my life. But I also felt a surge of pride. I had faced the monster and I hadn't flinched. I walked back toward the barn, the solid weight of my grandfather's key in my pocket. I had a home to protect. The first shot from Mountain View came in the form of a legal notice, an eviction order based on a claim that the property was unsafe and in violation of a dozen county codes. It was baseless, a transparent attempt to bury me in bureaucracy and legal fees right out of the gate. Ms. Albright was unfazed. "It's a classic slap suit," she explained over the phone. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're trying to silence you by making it too expensive to fight back. Don't worry, we'll file a motion to dismiss, but this is how it starts." The legal battle was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Papers were filed, motions were made. It was a world of arcane language and procedural delays designed to exhaust and intimidate. But having Ms. Albright on my side was like having a shield. She was methodical, relentless, and she knew their playbook inside and out. We used some of the money my grandfather had left to pay her retainer and the initial court fees. It felt right, using his savings to defend his legacy. While the lawyers fought, I worked. The small room I'd made livable became my base of operations, but my real focus was the barn. I spent hours every day cleaning and organizing it, treating it not as a dusty relic but as a living space. I swept away the thick blankets of sawdust, washed the grime from the windows, and let the light pour in. I carefully cleaned each of his tools, oiling the metal to ward off rust, sanding and waxing the wooden handles. It was a meditative process, a way of connecting with him. With each tool I restored, I felt like I was learning a piece of his soul. The community of Havenwood, which had at first been a collection of friendly but distant strangers, began to rally around me. Sal from the hardware store would drop off boxes of screws or extra lumber, refusing payment. "Just put it on Arthur's tab," he'd say with a wink. The woman from the diner started sending me home with containers of hot food, insisting I was too skinny. Word had gotten around about the lawsuit, about the city kid who was taking on the big developer. My fight, I realized, was becoming their fight. One evening, an old farmer named Mr. Henderson, whose property bordered mine, knocked on my door. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of long years under the sun. "Heard you're giving Mountain View hell," he said, holding out a basket of fresh vegetables. "Good. Arthur told me what they were up to. He was worried about the water. We all are. He told me that several other local landowners had been approached and pressured by the company. They had been too scared to fight back alone, but now, seeing me stand my ground, they were starting to talk to each other. That was the turning point. Ms. Albright and I organized a town meeting in the old Grange Hall. We expected a few dozen people. Over 200 showed up. Farmers, small business owners, families who had lived in the valley for generations. I stood at the front of the room, terrified, and told my story. I told them about my grandfather, about his letters, and about the file he had left behind. I told them about the aquifer. The room was silent as I spoke. Then, when I finished, the silence was broken by a wave of angry, determined voices. People stood up and shared their own stories of Mountain View's tactics, the intimidation, the lowball offers, the veiled threats. By the end of the night, we had formed a community action group. Ms. Albright had a list of a dozen other plaintiffs for a class action lawsuit, and the local newspaper reporter was furiously scribbling notes. The fight was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the whole valley. Mountain View retaliated. They escalated their legal attacks, and started a smear campaign in the regional papers, painting me as an opportunistic delinquent and the townspeople as ignorant farmers standing in the way of progress. It was ugly and it was draining. There were days I wanted to quit, days when the $500,000 offer echoed in my mind like a siren song. On those days, I would go into the barn and stand in front of the half-finished boat. I had started working on it. Using my grandfather's books and tools, I began to slowly, carefully continue what he had started. I learned to steam and bend the wood for the hull, to plane the planks until they were perfectly smooth. It was incredibly difficult, demanding a patience and precision I didn't know I possessed. But as the boat began to take shape, it became a symbol of my own transformation. It was a broken thing, left unfinished, that was slowly being made whole, just like me. The legal battle raged for nearly a year. It consumed most of the money my grandfather had left, but we held on. The turning point came when Ms. Albright, armed with the collective evidence from the townspeople, successfully petitioned the state's Environmental Protection Agency to investigate Mountain View's plans. Faced with a state-level inquiry and a class action lawsuit that was gaining media attention, the corporation's parent company finally blinked. Their business model relied on quiet, quick acquisitions, not protracted public fights. The bad press was costing them more than the valley was worth. One day, Ms. Albright called me. "They're pulling out," she said, her voice filled with a triumphant exhaustion. "They're dropping the lawsuits and selling all their land holdings in the county to a state conservation trust. We won, Leo. Your grandfather won." I hung up the phone and walked out of my little room into the bright afternoon sun. I looked at the barn, standing proud and solid against the blue sky. I looked at the fields, green and vibrant, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled. My knees washed over me. It was over. We had done it. I cried, not with sadness, but with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. Gratitude for a grandfather whose love was strong enough to reach across time. Gratitude for a community that had taken in a stray and made him one of their own. The victory wasn't a Hollywood ending. The scars remained. The town had spent a year under a cloud of stress and uncertainty. I was nearly broke, with just enough of my grandfather's money left to get by for a few more months. The farmhouse was still a ruin, a project that would take years, if not decades, to complete. But none of that mattered. We had protected this place. We had honored his fight. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I officially apprenticed myself to a cabinet maker in the next town over, honing the skills I had started to learn in the barn. I was earning a living with my hands, just like he had. I spent my evenings and weekends continuing my work on the property, slowly clearing the land, planting a garden, and making plans for the day I could start rebuilding the house. I was putting down roots, real roots for the first time in my life. The boat was nearly finished. It was beautiful, a testament to my grandfather's design and my own determination. I decided to name it the Arthur's Key. It felt right. The key he left me hadn't just opened a barn. It had unlocked a past I never knew, a community I never expected, and a future I had to fight for. It had opened the door to my own life. An inheritance isn't always about money or property. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can be left is a story you have to finish, a choice you have to make. My grandfather didn't leave me an easy life. He left me something far more important, a reason to build one. He left me a home, not in the form of a perfect house, but in the form of a purpose, a place to belong. And that's really what this all comes down to, isn't it? The search for that one place where you're not an outsider, where your past doesn't define you in a negative way, but instead gives you the strength to stand for something. My story started at a gate being locked out. but it truly began when I used a key to let myself in. So I want to ask you, what does home mean to you? Is it a place, a person, a feeling? Share it in the comments below. Your story matters. Every story of finding where you belong makes this world a little less lonely for someone else. And if these are the kinds of stories you want to see, the ones that dig a little deeper, then I hope you'll consider subscribing and being a part of this community. Thank you for listening.